She thought she was saving a kitten, just a shivering spotted bundle left at her doorstep in the Arizona woods. But what Heather Monroe was really doing was raising a queen of the wild. This isn't just a pet story, it's a journey of survival, transformation, and a bond that defies the laws of nature. Stay with us as we uncover a true tale of instinct, courage, and the raw magic that happens when the wild walks through your front door. And you open it. The crate on her porch. The sun had barely begun to rise over the dense pine woods of Flagstaff, Arizona. The early light cast long, golden slashes through the forest, illuminating frost still clinging to the tips of juniper bushes. Heather Monroe, 29, pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her slim frame as she stepped onto the creaky porch of her rustic cabin. She had moved here 6 months ago, escaping the noise of Phoenix for the quiet breath of trees and the promise of solitude. A steaming mug of black coffee warmed her hands, the scent mingling with crisp mountain air. Heather was striking in a subtle, earthy way. Wavy chestnut hair often pulled into a messy bun, light freckles brushing across her cheekbones, and gray-green eyes that always seemed to be observing, measuring. Despite her outward calm, Heather was a woman who carried a quiet kind of ache, the kind that came from having once believed in things, only to watch them fall apart. She had studied wildlife biology in college, spent time tracking mountain lions and photographing elk migrations. But now she worked from home, doing freelance graphic design to pay the bills, and rarely talked to anyone except the birds outside her window. That morning, she was halfway through her first sip of coffee when something moved near the edge of the porch. A flicker, barely there. She squinted. A small shape emerged from under the steps. It was a kitten, or at least that's what she thought at first. It looked maybe 6 or 7 weeks old, no bigger than a loaf of bread, covered in a dust-colored coat with black spots and tiny ears that twitched like radar dishes. Heather knelt slowly. The little creature didn't run. It just shivered, eyes wide, spine arched but too weak to hiss. She could see the bones beneath its fur. Its paws were too big for its legs. Its tail was short, stubby, even. Still, Heather's heart clenched. The maternal instinct kicked in before the logical one. "Hey there, little bean," she whispered. "You look like trouble." She stood and moved carefully, her boots crunching on frost, as she disappeared back into the cabin. 5 minutes later, she returned with an old plastic storage bin, a soft towel, a hand warmer, and a shallow dish of warmed goat's milk. She placed them gently beside the kitten. The little one didn't move for a moment. Then slowly, it dragged itself toward the heat, collapsed inside the towel, and began to lap the milk. That was the beginning of the story, of the bond, of something that could never be undone. Over the next 2 days, Heather nursed the kitten like she'd done with dozens of strays in her life. She fed it every 3 hours, used a damp rag to simulate a mother's grooming, checked its temperature, slept with one ear open, listening for whimpers in the night. But something gnawed at her. The kitten wasn't meowing, it was making a chirping sound. Its body was stockier than normal. The fur wasn't just soft, it was dense, layered. It growled when she tried to lift it after eating. And those eyes, amber and wild, not soft like a house cat's. More like something watching from behind a bush. 3 days after she found it, Heather sat on her porch with the little one bundled in a hoodie on her lap. She took a slow sip of her coffee and whispered, "You're not a kitten, are you?" The wind didn't answer, but deep in her chest she already knew. This wasn't a rescue, it was a calling. And she'd already said yes, not just a cat. The first few weeks were filled with a rhythm Heather hadn't known she missed. Bottle feeds every 4 hours. Daily weight checks, warm baths. Carefully logging temperature and stool changes. Her nights were broken, her days consumed. But strangely, she felt whole. The kitten, Juniper, she had named her, began to thrive. At first, Heather had believed she was some kind of unusual domestic mix, maybe a Bengal or a Maine Coon cross. But with each passing day, that theory unraveled. By week 2, Juniper's body had doubled in size. Her limbs were longer, her face more angular, her coat, a beautiful mess of warm gray, caramel, and black spots, grew denser, more weatherproof. And those ears, triangular, tall, with distinct tufts like tiny brushes. Every time Juniper tilted her head to listen, she looked less like a kitten and more like a creature born to vanish into trees. Heather watched in awe, documenting everything. Her camera roll was full of sleeping poses, intense stares, and the moment Juniper discovered how to jump onto the counter in a single leap. No matter how tired Heather felt, she couldn't look away. Something about Juniper was spellbinding, but the oddities continued. Juniper didn't meow. She chirped, short staccato sounds that resembled the alert calls of small wildcats in the Sonoran wilderness. She didn't purr in the usual way either. Hers was a low, rumbling vibration, more like a growl curled into trust. And then there was the play behavior. Heather had raised strays before, dozens. But this was different. Juniper didn't chase yarn balls. She stalked. She crouched low under furniture, belly to the floor, eyes locked on Heather's slippers, waiting until the moment was just right. Then she'd pounce, silent, calculated, no warning. Every movement was a lesson in predatory elegance. Heather stopped, bringing her into town. People would comment, "What a wild-looking little thing." Or worse, "That's not a kitten, that's a bobcat cub." The words would land like cold stones in her gut. She didn't want to believe it because if it were true, if Juniper really was a bobcat, it meant she didn't belong in Heather's world. She belonged to the wild. But Juniper didn't seem to know that. Every morning she would follow Heather into the kitchen, circling her feet like any house cat waiting for breakfast. She napped in a curled-up pose on Heather's couch. She rubbed against her knees. And at night, when the temperature dropped, Juniper would climb onto the foot of Heather's bed, curl up into a tight little ball of heat and fur, and fall asleep purring. What kind of wild animal did that? Heather clung to these contradictions like lifelines. Maybe she was special. Maybe Juniper could be both. Still, she couldn't ignore the warning signs. At 3 months, Juniper began climbing the cabinets, not like a curious kitten, but like a born mountaineer. She launched herself off curtain rods. She shredded the screen door trying to reach a squirrel. Once, Heather came home from the grocery store to find the garbage can turned over and the entire chicken she'd thawed missing, bone, plastic wrap and all. Juniper sat beside the mess, licking her paw and looking very pleased with herself. That's when Heather built the enclosure. It started as a large wooden crate on the back porch, 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep. She filled it with tree branches, a scratching log, climbing ramps, and a covered den. It was warm, safe, enriched, a compromise between a home and a habitat. But Juniper wanted more. She started pacing. Heather would wake in the night to the sound of claws on wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. A kind of wildness pulsed beneath Juniper's skin now, like something inside her was waking up. And that terrified Heather. One evening, she stood outside the enclosure, sipping chamomile tea, watching the bob kitten crouch silently behind a bushy bundle of pine branches. Juniper's eyes were locked on a rabbit grazing near the fence line. Heather didn't say a word. She watched as Juniper's tail twitched, slow and deliberate. The rabbit twitched too, and bolted. Juniper didn't pounce. She just watched, still as stone, silent. Then she turned and looked at Heather. And for the first time, Heather wasn't sure she recognized the gaze. It was no longer a house pet staring back. It was a creature of instinct, of wild blood, of Earth. Still, Heather whispered, "It's okay, baby. You're safe here." And Juniper blinked, then curled up on her wooden perch and fell asleep. The next morning, Heather made a decision. She pulled out her laptop and sent an email to someone she hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. Dr. Rachel Klein, a field vet and wildlife specialist with Arizona Wildlife Rescue. Heather had interned under her during her junior year at university. They hadn't spoken in ages, but if anyone could tell her the truth, it was Rachel. She sent 3 photos, one of Juniper sleeping, one of her walking across the porch railing, and one close-up of her face. Underneath, Heather wrote, "Hey, Rach, I think I need your expertise. This little girl found me 6 weeks ago. She was sick, starving, tiny. I've been raising her like a kitten, but something's not adding up. Could she be?" The email hung in the air like a blade, because Heather knew what Rachel would say, and she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. But it didn't matter. The truth was coming, whether she wanted it or not. Raising a queen. The reply came less than an hour later. Heather hadn't even made it to her second cup of coffee when her phone pinged with the subject line, "We need to talk. Now." Rachel Klein didn't do drama. She was blunt, clinical, and sharp as glass, traits that had made her both respected and, at times, intimidating during Heather's wildlife biology days. Heather's stomach tightened. She opened the email. "Heather, that's a bobcat. A female, likely around 12 to 14 weeks. You can't keep her, not long term. Call me. This is serious." Heather stared at the screen, her fingers numb around the mug. She wasn't surprised, not really. Somewhere in her gut, she'd known for days. Juniper was wild. She was never meant for porch railings or cuddle blankets. She was meant for rivers, mountains, for dirt under her claws and prey in her teeth. But knowing and accepting were 2 very different things. Heather's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. Rachel's voice crackled through the speaker. "You're lucky she imprinted on you, Heather. If she hadn't, she could have attacked by now. Or escaped. Either way, you'd be in serious legal and ethical trouble." "I didn't know," Heather whispered. "I thought she was a feral kitten." "She probably was orphaned. Happens more often than you'd think. Fire season's been brutal. You live near the Coconino line, right?" Heather nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just outside." "Then it makes sense. We've had a few rescues from that area. Juniper's lucky you found her when you did. But she's not a pet, Heather. She never will be." Heather glanced through the window, where Juniper was perched on a stump in the enclosure, eyes closed, tail twitching. A wild queen in a borrowed kingdom. Rachel continued, "You've got options. I can take her. Get her to a sanctuary or into our rewilding program. But you need to act fast. At her age, the longer she stays domesticated, the harder it'll be to release her later." Heather's chest ached. Sanctuary, release, rewilding. All those words felt like goodbyes, wrapped in science. But the idea of someone else handling Juniper, strapping her down, sedating her, locking her into a sterile space, Heather couldn't stomach it. "She trusts me," she said softly. "I know," Rachel replied. "That's why I'm offering something else. It's rare, and a lot of work." "I'm listening." Rachel explained the requirements. Heather would need a wildlife rehab permit, monthly veterinary inspections, an escape-proof enclosure with vertical barriers and enrichment rotation. She'd need to start minimizing physical affection and train Juniper with reward-based wild behavior cues. And most of all, she'd need to accept that this wasn't forever. Juniper would have to be returned to the wild when she was ready. 6 months, maybe a year. If Heather couldn't agree to that, the option was off the table. That night, Heather barely slept. She lay in bed, one hand resting on the edge where Juniper had once curled. Now the bob kitten slept in her new enclosure outside, her thick coat shimmering under the moonlight like wild silk. Heather watched her through the glass. She thought of all the things they'd done. Early morning feeds, sun-drenched naps, the time Juniper fell asleep inside Heather's hoodie like a baby possum. But she also thought of the way Juniper's pupils narrowed when squirrels ran past. How she paced before storms. How she stared at the trees like they were calling her home. Could she do it? Raise her. Train her. And then let her go? Heather whispered into the darkness. You're not mine. I just got to borrow you for a while. Juniper twitched in her sleep. The next day marked the beginning of something new. Heather filled out the first set of rehab license applications and started documenting everything: meals, weights, behaviors. She installed motion cameras in the enclosure and upgraded the fencing to extend 10 feet high with reinforced mesh. She added logs, scent boxes, elevated platforms, and buried frozen prey for stimulation. Juniper thrived. She was a blur of grace and ferocity, darting between tree trunks and scaling branches like gravity was a suggestion. Heather kept her distance more now. Touch became rare. No more belly rubs or lap naps. Instead, she trained Juniper using red laser dots to simulate prey movement, taught her to hide food, introduced fur-covered decoys for hunting practice. Still, there were moments, fleeting, fragile, where Juniper would sit beside her enclosure's edge, watching Heather with quiet, golden eyes. And sometimes she would chirp, just once. A sound that cracked Heather's resolve every time. The local vet, Dr. Elise Tran, visited monthly now, ensuring Juniper's health was on track. Elise was impressed. You're doing this right, she said. Most people would have panicked or tried to keep her as a pet, but you're raising a predator with dignity. Heather smiled, though her heart pulled tight. Dignity, yes. But dignity didn't make it hurt less. Then came the first test. It was a cold morning in early February when the enclosure door was accidentally left unlatched. Heather had stepped out to refill water, and the click hadn't held. She turned back and saw nothing. The crate was open. Juniper was gone. The forest, wide and waiting, swallowed the space where she'd stood. Panic surged like ice through Heather's veins. She ran. No shoes, no coat, just instinct. She called. She searched for tracks in the snow. She shouted until her voice cracked. Nothing! She fell to her knees by the pine grove, fists clutching the earth. Heart breaking. She whispered, I wasn't ready. But just as she rose to return home, something moved. A flash of gray, amber eyes. Juniper emerged from behind a bush, tail flicking, a dead mouse in her jaws. She dropped it at Heather's feet, and then, without touching her, without staying, she turned and padded silently back to the enclosure. Heather followed, stunned. Juniper walked in, sat down, licked her paw. Heather closed the latch. Their eyes met. A message passed between them. I'm wild, but I'm not done with you yet. The sky turned orange. The wind changed before the sky did. Heather had lived in Flagstaff long enough to recognize it, not just the shift in direction, but the strange, anxious pressure in the air. The birds knew it too. They vanished. By mid-morning, the sunlight was tinted with a strange copper hue, and the air began to smell like scorched pine needles and dry earth. Juniper paced the far end of the enclosure, low to the ground, her movements restless and tight. Heather stepped out onto the porch, her eyes narrowed against the thickening haze creeping over the treetops. Something was wrong. A low, vibrating boom echoed in the distance. Then another, closer. Thunder. Number. The wildfire alerts came at 11:17 a.m. Her phone shrieked with an emergency evacuation notice, the screen flashing, Coconino National Forest, East Ridge Fire, Evacuate now! The fire was moving fast. Too fast. She had hours, maybe less. Heather's hands shook as she grabbed her pre-packed bug-out bag from the hall closet. Food, water, first aid, her laptop, USB drives. The emergency crate for Juniper. She ran out to the enclosure, gasping slightly as the thickening smoke clawed at her throat. "Juniper, come on, baby!" Juniper didn't move. She stood stiff and wild, eyes locked on the dark plumes rolling in from the tree line. She hissed low, not at Heather, but at the wind. Heather flung open the gate, holding the carrier. "Please, you have to trust me." Juniper backed away. Her ears flattened. She crouched low, undecided. Heather stepped inside the enclosure. Bad idea. She knew that. The vet had warned her, never trap a maturing wildcat. But this wasn't training anymore. This was survival. She moved slowly, heart pounding, until she was close enough to toss a blanket over Juniper, wrap her tight, and slide her into the crate. Juniper fought for a moment, teeth bared, claws striking the sides. But then she stopped. Maybe it was the tone in Heather's voice, or maybe she could smell the fear, real, human, helpless fear. Heather secured the crate and ran back to the cabin. By now, ash was falling like dirty snow, clinging to her jacket, sticking in her hair. The trees to the west were glowing, an unnatural orange shimmer rising behind them. She loaded Juniper into the back seat of her battered Jeep. As she turned the ignition, the world around them crackled with tension. Flames weren't visible yet, but they were coming. She could feel it. Heather gripped the wheel, whispering a promise more to herself than anyone else. "We're getting out, both of us." And with that, she drove toward the only road that wasn't covered in smoke, toward uncertainty, toward safety, and toward the next chapter neither of them were ready for. But fate wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Into the flame. The road twisted like a snake through the forest, the smoke thickening with every mile. Heather's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as ash flurried past her windshield like gray confetti. The Jeep's tires skidded slightly on gravel, and her breath hitched when a burning branch crashed onto the shoulder ahead. "Easy. Just keep moving," she whispered, glancing into the rearview mirror. Juniper's crate was strapped in behind her. The bobcat crouched low, eyes wide, ears flat. She wasn't snarling. She wasn't panicking. She was watching, waiting. Suddenly the road was blocked. A massive pine had fallen, its smoking limbs sprawling across the only path forward. Heather slammed the brakes, her heart lurching. "No! No! No!" She jumped out, coughing hard as acrid smoke seared her lungs. She tried pushing a limb. It didn't budge. There was no way through. She scrambled back into the Jeep, flicking open the map app on her phone, though reception was barely holding. A thin service road appeared on the screen, a logging path to the east. It wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. She reversed, gravel spitting beneath the tires, and turned down the rough, narrow road. For a moment, it worked. Then the wind shifted again, and with it came fire. Orange light erupted from the right side of the woods like a living thing, charging through the underbrush, devouring pine needles and branches in seconds. Heather screamed, "Hang on!" and floored the accelerator. Branches slapped against the windshield. The Jeep jolted over roots and ruts, throwing her into her seatbelt. The temperature spiked. Flames licked the roadside now, their hunger deafening. And that's when she heard it. A shrill, desperate bleat. An animal, alive. She braked hard. Juniper was up now, clawing at the crate, eyes locked on something in the trees. Heather followed her gaze. There, behind a screen of brush, a baby mule deer lay trapped, its leg caught in a metal fence, partially collapsed by fire. Its cries were hoarse, terrified. Heather's instincts screamed, "Leave it! Save yourself!" But another voice whispered louder, the one that knew why Juniper was clawing the crate. Why she wasn't panicking. She was pointing, Heather leapt from the jeep and dashed into the smoke. She couldn't feel her legs, couldn't see clearly. Her hands fumbled at the wire, burning, twisting. The fawn kicked weakly. Juniper cried out from the car, one sharp, guttural chirp. Finally, the fence gave way. The fawn limped free, bolting into the forest opposite the flames. Heather staggered back, coughing, skin stinging, lungs raw. She collapsed into the driver's seat, tears streaking down soot-covered cheeks. Juniper had curled herself against the crate wall, her breath shallow. Heather reached back, hand resting on the crate. "You did that," she rasped. "You saved it." And somehow, in that moment of chaos, fire, and pain, Heather realized something deeper than instinct. Juniper wasn't just a wild creature. She was becoming a guardian of the wild, and she had just proven it. A queen can't be caged. 2 weeks after the fire, the mountains were quiet again. But they weren't the same. Charred trees clawed the sky like blackened bones, and the once green forest bore the scars of nature's fury. Heather sat on the edge of her porch. What was left of it? The cabin had survived, barely. Half the roof had caved. The porch was cracked and soot-streaked. Her garden gone. But she was alive, and so was Juniper. That should have been enough. It wasn't. News had spread faster than the flames ever did. A woman had evacuated with a bobcat in a pet crate. A wildlife rescue volunteer had entered an active fire zone to save a deer. A so-called rehabber had raised a wild animal in her home. The media latched on with claws of their own. The headlines were everywhere. Wild queen or dangerous pet. Woman defies evacuation to save predator. Flagstaff, bobcat sparks, legal uproar. Reporters appeared on the dirt road, like flies to honey, snapping pictures through her fence. Juniper, who had once been curious and bold, now stayed hidden most of the day. Heather received anonymous letters, some praising her as a guardian angel, others not so kind. One neighbor, Steve Hartley, the same man who had once complained about Juniper climbing his fence, filed a report with Arizona Fish and Game. Said Heather was endangering the community, that bobcats were wild animals, not projects, that she had no right to keep one, even temporarily. And soon the state responded. She was summoned to a formal wildlife hearing in Phoenix. The hearing hall felt like a courtroom without a judge, just a panel of experts, pens clicking, eyes narrowed. Dr. Rachel Klein sat beside Heather, her presence steady but grave. A man in a stiff blazer read from a paper. "Miss Monroe, your case poses a number of legal and ethical concerns. This bobcat, Juniper, has imprinted. She is no longer a neutral wild specimen. The law requires—" Heather didn't hear the rest. She watched Juniper's videos play on a projection screen. Her climbing, hunting, chirping, sleeping in the crate. A wildlife specialist cleared his throat. "It is remarkable, no doubt. But let's be honest. What you've done is blur the line between human affection and wild instinct." Heather stood, voice quiet but firm. "I didn't ask for this. She came to me half dead. I made a choice to help, yes, but I never meant to keep her. I only meant to give her a chance to become what she was meant to be." A pause. "I raised a wild queen. Not a house cat, not a pet, a queen." The room was silent. Then Rachel stepped forward. "She's ready. Not for a cage, but for training. For monitored transition. With Heather's continued partnership, I believe Juniper can be reintroduced to the wild, with the grace and dignity she was born to carry." After a long deliberation, the panel delivered its verdict. Juniper would not be confiscated. But Heather had 6 months to complete an intensive wildlife release protocol. No more pet behaviors. No more human comforts. If Juniper showed signs of dependency, she would be placed in a sanctuary. Forever. It was the hardest kind of mercy. Because now, Heather would have to prepare for something she'd never been good at. Letting go, into the pines. 6 months. That's what the state had given her. Heather marked each day with a pencil stroke on the edge of the kitchen cabinet. What was left of the kitchen, anyway? She rebuilt most of the cabin herself, with soot still clinging to the floorboards and smoke memories baked into the walls. It felt both like home and a waiting room. Juniper, now nearly full-grown, was no longer the chirping ball of fluff she'd once cradled in a hoodie. She was a sleek, muscular force of nature, 3 feet long, 25 pounds of muscle and mystery. Her rosette-spotted coat shimmered with health, and her once bright eyes had deepened into something feral and watchful. She moved through her expanded enclosure like a shadow, silent, measured, free in all the ways that mattered, except the final one. Heather followed the rewilding protocol with military precision. No touch, minimal eye contact. Juniper's food was hidden or buried. No more calling her name, no more crate training. Every action was meant to teach Juniper the hardest truth of all, that love had to step aside so instinct could lead. Heather had never felt so close to breaking. At night, she lay awake, listening for movement outside the window. Sometimes she'd hear Juniper's chirp echo faintly through the trees, and it would hurt more than any silence ever could. One morning in late spring, Rachel returned for Juniper's final evaluation. She watched Juniper stalk, climb, freeze in place at the sound of a twig snap. "She's ready," Rachel said simply. Heather nodded, though her heart screamed no. The release site was deep in the Sedona wilderness, miles of red rock cliffs, winding creeks, and thick juniper forest. It was paradise, untouched, isolated, fierce, just like her. The morning of the release, Heather drove in silence with Juniper crated in the back, her golden eyes watching the world blur past. When they arrived, Rachel guided them to a secluded glade near a spring-fed stream. No ceremony, no goodbyes, just a quiet place and the moment they'd both been preparing for. Heather opened the crate. Juniper didn't move, not at first. Then, slowly, gracefully, she stepped out. The earth welcomed her like an old friend. Juniper didn't look back. She vanished into the trees, her body low, tail flicking. Heather stood motionless. Not a tear, not a word. Just the wind through the leaves and the echo of something that had once been hers, and no longer was. Weeks passed, then months. Heather returned to her life. What was left of it? She still lived in the cabin, still walked the trails every morning. But something in her had changed. She started volunteering at wildlife rehab centers, using her experience with Juniper to help guide new fosters. She built an extension onto her property, an outdoor facility licensed through the state, equipped to handle temporary wild orphan rescues. She named it Wild Queen Sanctuary. Not a shelter, not a zoo. A second chance. She wrote about Juniper, too. Not for fame, but for memory. A memoir, short essays, journal entries posted online. She called it, "The Kitten Who Taught Me to Let Go." And people responded. Emails, letters, donations, stories from others who had bonded with wild things and had to give them back. Heather realized she was not alone. 1 year after the release, Heather returned to the Sedona site with Rachel. They sat in silence beneath the trees, surrounded by silence. No sign of Juniper. No sounds except the stream and the bird's song. Until dusk. That's when Heather felt it. A shift, a presence. She turned slowly. On a high red ridge just a few yards away stood a bobcat. Larger now, older, but unmistakable. Golden eyes, tufted ears. Juniper. She didn't approach, didn't make a sound. She just stood, still as the stone beneath her paws, watching, remembering. And in that fleeting, breathless moment, their eyes met. Heather didn't call out, didn't move. She simply smiled. Juniper turned, melted back into the trees, gone again, not lost, just wild, exactly where she was meant to be. Not every act of love looks the same. Sometimes it means holding on. Other times, it means letting go. Heather's journey with Juniper reminds us that the deepest connections aren't always about possession. They're about respect, trust, and knowing when to set someone free so they can become who they were born to be. In our lives, we all face moments like this, where instinct meets emotion and choice demands courage. Whether it's a relationship, a dream, or even a part of ourselves we're afraid to release, the wild calls. And the bravest thing we can do is answer. At Paw Prints and Stories, we share these tales not just to warm hearts, but to awaken them. So if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of your own wild queen, or something you once had to let go, stay with us. Join the pack, because every print has a story, and yours might be next. What would you do if the wild knocked on your door? Would you open it or walk away?